April 1945. Berlin was dying. The once proud capital of the Reich had become a city of smoke, rubble, and fire. Soviet artillery thundered across the horizon, shaking the cracked windows of abandoned apartments. Civilians ran for the subways while soldiers, barely old enough to shave, stumbled through the streets with haunted eyes. In the chaos, one man moved with a strange calm. Colonel Erich Vollner. A decorated Wehrmacht officer known for his discipline and precision, Vollner was not the kind to panic. That morning he entered the courtyard of the War Ministry with a briefcase chained to his wrist and a steel box clutched under his arm. Inside were documents marked Geheime Reichssache, top-secret files, along with a fortune in gold coins, medals, and family heirlooms wrapped in cloth. Witnesses later recalled seeing him order his adjutant to bring the staff car around, a black Mercedes 320 Cabriolet, polished even as bombs fell from the sky. He loaded the trunk himself, checked the pistol at his hip, and gave a final salute to no one in particular. The colonel's plan was simple: reach the Bavarian Alps, where remnants of the German High Command were rumored to regroup. But there was something different in his eyes, not loyalty, but desperation. The city was falling apart around him, and with it, the world he'd built his life upon. As the car rolled past burning buildings, Vollner glanced once at the Reichstag dome, already wreathed in flames. Somewhere beyond the smoke lay freedom, or at least survival. At 5:27 a.m., the Mercedes crossed the Potsdamer Bridge, heading southwest out of the city. That was the last confirmed sighting of Colonel Erich Vollner. Soldiers on guard duty recalled the car's headlights cutting through the dust and ash before vanishing into the darkness. Hours later, Berlin would be surrounded. The colonel's name would appear in no surrender list, no prisoner ledger, no grave. He had simply driven into history and disappeared. Vollner wasn't alone. Two drivers, a secretary named Lotte Engel, and a supply truck carrying fuel, rations, and personal belongings, followed him out of Berlin that night. Their route, later pieced together from fragments of testimony, led southwest toward Dresden, before turning south into the Bavarian forests. For 3 days, the small convoy was seen passing through villages in chaos, soldiers retreating, refugees fleeing, roads clogged with carts and bodies. Then, near the Czech border, they vanished. No wreckage was found, no documents recorded their arrival anywhere. In the post-war confusion, thousands had gone missing, but Vollner's disappearance stood out. He was too senior, too meticulous to simply vanish. Intelligence reports from 1946 mention rumors of a Wehrmacht colonel escaping with gold, heading toward the Alpenfestung, the mythical Alpine fortress where the Nazi elite planned their last stand. Others believed he was carrying sensitive research files, blueprints, names, locations, evidence the Allies were desperate to secure before the Soviets. When the dust settled, investigators searched the route between Dresden and Berchtesgaden. They found burned vehicles, uniforms, and bones, but nothing tied to Vollner. His Mercedes, his papers, his people, all gone. By 1950, the Allies listed him as presumed dead, but the whispers never stopped. Letters surfaced in Argentina and Chile bearing his signature. A photo from 1952 showed a man who looked like him at a cafe in Buenos Aires. Nothing was confirmed, but the legend grew. Colonel Erich Vollner, the ghost of Berlin, had escaped justice and built a new life in the shadows of South America. For decades, treasure hunters searched for his convoy, the gold, the car, the truth, somewhere between the crumbling roads of Saxony and the snow-choked passes of the Alps. But until now, no one had found a trace. Nearly 8 decades after Berlin's fall, the story of Colonel Erich Vollner had become little more than a historical curiosity, a mystery buried under layers of rumor and speculation. But in January 2024, a historian named Clara Neumann stumbled upon something no one had seen in 79 years. She had been cataloging declassified military archives in a dimly lit basement beneath the German Federal Records Office in Koblenz when she noticed a folder wedged behind a rusted filing cabinet. The label, yellowed and faint, read, Operation Vacancy, Abteilung Ivo B. It shouldn't have existed. The registry showed no record of any such operation. When she opened it, the stale smell of paper and dust filled the air, and inside lay a collection of documents that would rewrite one of the last unsolved mysteries of World War II. The file contained hand-drawn maps of the Bavarian Alps, their edges stained by moisture and time. Several locations were circled in red pencil, annotated with military shorthand. In the corner of one map, the name Königssee Sector 12 appeared next to a date, April 29, 1945, just one day before Hitler's suicide. Among the pages was a requisition order typed on fading carbon paper, 10 liters of fuel, climbing ropes, cold weather gear, and sealed containers for transport. At the bottom, a familiar signature scrawled in blue ink, Oberst Erich Vollner. Clara's hands trembled as she traced the signature. This was no rumor. It was proof the colonel had survived beyond Berlin and that he'd planned something deep in the mountains. Another document, stamped Vertraulich, Eyes Only, referenced a cache containing sensitive materials of Reich importance to be secured until the restoration of order. It was dated May 5, 1945, days after Germany's surrender. Clara leaned back in disbelief. Someone had continued the mission after the war officially ended. The coordinates pointed to a region near Berchtesgaden, the same area where Vollner was last rumored to be heading. The forgotten file was no longer a curiosity. It was a map and, perhaps, an invitation to uncover the truth buried beneath the Bavarian stone. Long before Clara's discovery, the mountains above Königssee had been haunted by rumors, stories of buried gold, missing convoys, and sealed tunnels that no one was meant to find. Locals spoke of soldiers seen at night in the spring of 1945, digging beneath the cover of fog, hauling crates into caves and sealing the entrances with explosives. For decades, treasure hunters combed the region, guided by superstition and greed. They brought metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and hope, only to find empty tunnels, rusted helmets, and collapsed mine shafts. The earth itself seemed determined to keep its secrets. In the small village of Ramsau, an old miner named Otto Feldman kept a journal that few ever read. In his entries from 1946, he described strange sounds echoing through the mountains, engines, voices, and once a faint metallic clang, like tools striking stone. But it was a single line on the final page that caught Clara's attention when she found a copy of his writings in the Königssee Museum archives. There is a sealed cavern near the eastern ridge. I marked it with 3 crosses on the rock. No one should open it. For years it had been dismissed as folklore, the ramblings of a man haunted by the aftermath of war. But when Clara overlaid the miner's map with the coordinates from Vollner's file, something impossible happened. They matched. Every marking, every ridge, every annotation aligned perfectly. The sealed cavern Feldman warned about sat exactly where Operation Valkensee's final red circle lay. And if Vollner had indeed made it that far, the truth might still be waiting inside, frozen in darkness, untouched since the day Berlin burned. August 2024. The air above Berchtesgaden was thin and still, the mountains quiet beneath a pale sky. Deep inside a restricted sector of the national park, an area long closed to the public due to unstable terrain, 2 experienced spelunkers, Marcus Heller and Jonas Weber, were mapping an uncharted cave system for a geological survey. They had no idea they were about to stumble into one of Germany's most chilling discoveries in decades. The entrance was barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, a jagged opening hidden by moss and years of debris. They descended slowly, headlamps cutting through centuries of untouched darkness. The air grew colder with every meter. The floor leveled out into a tunnel that appeared unnaturally straight, as if once carved or reinforced by human hands. Marcus stopped first, shining his light against a section of wall where the stone didn't quite match the rest. Behind it, dust shifted, the faint echo of hollow space. They exchanged a glance. Then, with careful hands, Jonas pried loose a slab of stone, and the wall gave way with a dull, echoing crack. A faint metallic shape gleamed beneath decades of dust. At first it looked like machinery, a rusted curve of metal coated in soil, until Marcus brushed away the dirt and froze. What stared back at him was unmistakable. A Mercedes grille, its silver star half buried but still glinting under the beam of his headlamp. Nearby lay a tattered scrap of fabric, faded gray, frayed at the edges, with an eagle and swastika insignia barely visible under the grime. Jonas whispered, "We shouldn't be here." Marcus took a photo anyway. They backed out slowly, hearts pounding, the weight of history pressing in around them. Above ground, the two men immediately alerted the authorities, handing over their coordinates to the Berchtesgaden police. Within hours, the site was sealed off, and military archaeologists arrived. The discovery spread quietly at first, a rumor among locals, another Nazi gold story in a region famous for them. But when the first photographs leaked to the press, the rusted grille, the insignia, the coordinates, it was clear this wasn't a legend anymore. Something had been hidden beneath those mountains, and it had just been found. Within days, the cavern became a full-scale excavation site. Under floodlights and protective tents, archaeologists, forensic experts, and military historians worked in silence. Every move was documented, every breath deliberate. What they uncovered next left even the most skeptical among them speechless. Behind the stone wall lay an entire vehicle, a black Mercedes 320 Cabriolet, its body remarkably preserved by cold, dry air. The car's tires were deflated, the chrome dulled by rust, but its shape was unmistakable, the same model used by Wehrmacht officers during the war. As the team cleared debris from the interior, a flash of dull brown caught the light, a leather holster resting on the passenger seat, still containing a Luger P08 pistol. Then came the papers, brittle, water-stained, but legible. Wehrmacht letterhead, signatures, seals. Among them a folded document naming Oberst Erich Vollner. The silence that followed was suffocating. One of the technicians whispered, "It's him." But the real shock came when they reached the driver's seat. Behind the wheel sat the skeletal remains of a man, his hand still resting near the steering column. The bones were yellowed, the jaw slightly ajar, as if frozen mid-breath. He wasn't wearing a uniform. Instead, a tattered civilian overcoat hung from his shoulders. Wool, not military issue. No medals, no insignia, no rank. A man stripped of identity. In the glove compartment, they found a cigarette case engraved with the initials EV, along with a photograph of a woman and child, their faces faded beyond recognition. The team stepped back, unsure of what they'd just uncovered. It looked like a tomb, not a crash site. There were no signs of impact or struggle. The car hadn't fallen here, it had been placed, entombed deliberately. News of the discovery leaked within hours. Headlines across Europe exploded, missing Nazi colonel's car found in Bavarian cave. But as experts began analyzing the scene, one question echoed louder than the rest. If this was Colonel Vollner's car, then who was the man behind the wheel? At first it seemed straightforward. The remains in the driver's seat were catalogued, photographed, and sent to the forensic lab in Munich. Within a week, preliminary results came back. Male, approximately 40 to 50 years old, consistent with the age Colonel Erich Vollner would have been in 1945. But something didn't add up. The preservation of the bones suggested the body hadn't been there since the war's end. Radiocarbon dating placed the death somewhere between 1958 and 1965, nearly 20 years after Berlin fell. Even stranger, fragments of fabric found near the remains weren't military issue from the 1940s, but from post-war West German manufacture. When investigators examined the Wehrmacht papers recovered from the glove compartment, their confusion deepened. The ink contained synthetic compounds that didn't exist until the 1950s. The documents were genuine originals, but they had been handled, perhaps reprinted, years later. Someone had taken extraordinary effort to reconstruct the illusion of a wartime escape. The buttons found on the tattered overcoat didn't match the rest of the uniform, and one bore a manufacturer's mark from 1957. Whoever had buried the car had done so deliberately, choosing what to leave behind, what to fake, and what to erase. But why? The excavation expanded, the cave cordoned off under armed supervision. Speculation spread like wildfire. Some claimed it was part of a Cold War intelligence cover-up. Others whispered about hidden Nazi gold or secret scientific research smuggled out of Berlin. Clara Neumann, now officially attached to the investigation, stood by the cavern entrance as forensic lights flickered against the walls. "Someone wanted us to find this," she murmured, her breath fogging in the cold air, but not to understand it. Weeks later, an underground survey revealed something the first team had missed, a narrow passage extending deeper into the mountain, sealed by a collapse of stone. Ground-penetrating radar detected hollow space beyond it, another chamber. When the team cleared the debris, the stale air that escaped was thick with the smell of iron and age. What they found inside would shatter every theory they had built so far. The chamber beyond the wall was smaller, its ceiling low and uneven, the floor littered with debris. At first it looked empty, until one of the archaeologists spotted a shape wedged between two boulders. A boot. Not just any boot, but the distinctive high-shaft leather style issued to Luftwaffe pilots. When they lifted the stones away, another skeleton came into view, curled as if in sleep. The bones were brittle, the uniform around them reduced to dust and thread. But the boots, remarkably intact, bore Luftwaffe insignia, and beside them lay a rusted sidearm, an officer's Walther P-38. This man had died facing the wall, as though hiding from something, or protecting it. A faint glimmer caught the light near his outstretched hand. A corroded metal case, sealed tight with clasps still intact. On its surface, stenciled in flaking black paint, were two words that sent a chill through the room. Geheime Dokumente, secret documents. It took hours to cut the case open without destroying its contents. Inside, they found layers of oilcloth wrapped around stacks of papers, water-damaged but legible enough to read. The first page bore the Reich's Black Eagle seal and the title Project Morgenröte, Project Dawn. The documents listed personnel names, laboratory coordinates, and materials requisitioned from facilities in Dresden and Vienna during the war's final months. There were references to human resilience trials, biological preservation, and something called Stufe 3, Stage 3. None of it made sense, but all of it pointed to one conclusion. Vollner hadn't been fleeing the war. He had been protecting something far more valuable than gold. The second skeleton's identity remained unknown, but one theory began to take shape, that he had been part of Vollner's convoy, tasked with guarding the hidden cache. Clara studied the files late into the night, the words swimming before her eyes. Every answer led to a darker question. If these documents were real, then the story of Colonel Vollner's escape wasn't about survival at all. It was about secrecy, and whatever he had hidden beneath the Bavarian rock was never meant to see the light again. The stack of documents from the sealed metal case was carefully sorted under ultraviolet light in the Munich Archive Laboratory. Each page revealed more than ink, impressions of handwriting, fingerprints, water stains that told their own quiet stories of time and secrecy. But among the hundreds of typewritten forms and coded reports, one single page stood apart. Folded tightly and sealed in wax that had long since crumbled, it was written in hurried, uneven script. The date at the top read, May 12, 1945, a full week after Germany's official surrender. The paper trembled slightly in Clara's gloved hands as she unfolded it. The message was brief, only 2 sentences. "I cannot let them find what we carried. Forgive me." Signed at the bottom, E.V. Erich Vollner. For the first time since the excavation began, the colonel's voice spoke across nearly 8 decades, raw and human. It sounded like guilt, or perhaps fear. But as the lab's chemical analysis came back, the mystery twisted again. The ink contained polyvinyl resin compounds, synthetic materials that weren't available until at least the mid-1950s. Whoever wrote this note wanted it to appear as if it had been written in the dying days of the Reich, but the science refused to lie. The confession was real handwriting, verified against known samples of Vollner's signature. But it had been written years after his supposed disappearance. That discovery sent ripples through the investigative team. If Vollner had survived into the post-war era, why fake his own death? And what exactly was it that they couldn't be allowed to find? As Clara studied the note, she noticed faint impressions on the reverse, the pressure of another page written on top of it, words that had transferred faintly into the fibers. Under infrared scanning, fragments became visible, coordinates, references to storage units, and a word she recognized from the sealed documents, Morgenröte, Project Dawn. The implications were staggering. Either someone wanted to keep that project buried forever, or someone wanted to rewrite its history. The note, meant as a confession, now read like a warning. The deeper Clara went into the labyrinth of Vollner's past, the more the story felt like a trap, layers of truth and fabrication tangled together until no one could tell them apart. She needed help, someone who could read the invisible history behind documents, the faint fingerprints of forgery. That's when she reached out to Lucas Brandt, a forensic archivist known for uncovering Cold War propaganda fakes and hidden intelligence operations. Lucas was methodical, skeptical, and brilliant, the kind of man who trusted evidence more than people. Within hours of examining the cave logs, he noticed something everyone else had missed. The rock strata near the Mercedes showed signs of disturbance, not from the 1940s, but from the 1960s. Soil compression analysis confirmed it. The cave had been reopened decades after Vollner's disappearance, its entrance resealed with modern concrete mixed into the original limestone dust. That single detail changed everything. Lucas traced government mining and geological records from that period and found a coded reference to a NATO engineering project under the name Operation Rückkehr, Operation Return. The classified mission, launched in 1962, involved recovery and evaluation of wartime materials of technical or strategic interest. Its geographical coordinates matched the same sector of Berchtesgaden, where Vollner's cave now stood. Someone had been there before, not treasure hunters, but soldiers. Clara and Lucas uncovered fragments of declassified NATO correspondence, confirming that several sealed sites across Germany and Austria had been quietly accessed during the Cold War to retrieve hidden Nazi research before the Soviets could. But this one had been different. There was no record of what had been taken, or by whom. Standing before the cave's dark mouth one gray morning, Lucas ran his hand along the rock and whispered, "They came back for something, and they didn't want anyone to know." The silence of the mountains offered no reply, only the weight of secrets, still buried in the stone. In the weeks that followed, Lucas and Clara buried themselves in the archives of NATO's Supreme Headquarters in Brussels. Most of the files were redacted or lost in bureaucratic oblivion, but one partially declassified report caught Lucas's attention, Operation Harpoon, stamped Top Secret, 1959. Its description was chillingly familiar. Recovery and neutralization of Reich scientific assets before adversarial acquisition. The attached memo mentioned several retrieval sites, among them a coded reference to Sector K-12 Berchtesgaden, the exact location of the cave where Vollner's car had been found. Suddenly, the pattern came into focus. The mission had been conducted under the pretense of Cold War containment, but its real objective was far older, a scavenger hunt for Nazi research hidden before Germany's collapse. The deeper Lucas dug, the more unsettling the details became. Operation Harpoon was overseen by a joint intelligence committee composed of American, British, and West German officers. Among the signatories of the final report was a name that stopped Clara cold, Major Erich Vollner, listed as a consultant, technical liaison. Her pulse quickened. If the file was genuine, the colonel hadn't died in 1945. He had been working with NATO 14 years later. The official records showed no trace of him after that. No address, no pension, no obituary. He had appeared just long enough to help locate and secure hidden research materials, then vanished again. But why had he returned to Berchtesgaden, the same mountains he once fled to? What had he been trying to protect, or perhaps conceal, all over again? The revelation reframed everything they thought they knew. Vollner's escape from Berlin hadn't been an act of desperation. It had been an extraction. Maybe the car in the cave wasn't a tomb at all, but a message, or a diversion planted decades later to hide what really happened. As Clara stared at the yellowing NATO documents under the sterile light, she whispered, "He didn't run from the war. He carried it with him." The next breakthrough came not from the archives, but from the laboratory. Forensic analysts in Munich had been studying trace materials taken from the Mercedes, oil residues, fibers, and soil samples sealed in containers since the excavation. When the results arrived, they turned the investigation on its head. The car's fuel system contained synthetic additives developed in West Germany in the mid-1950s, nearly a decade after the war ended. Even the rust patterns on the undercarriage showed inconsistent aging, as though it had been exposed to moisture, then moved, then sealed again. Carbon dating placed the last exposure to open air sometime around 1963. The evidence was irrefutable. The car had been deliberately relocated and entombed long after the war. But by whom, and for what purpose? Lucas reviewed the excavation photos again, noticing subtle anomalies. Tire marks leading into the chamber that didn't match the cave's original dimensions, and concrete fragments embedded in the soil identical to samples from NATO fortifications of the same era. Someone had reconstructed the scene piece by piece to resemble a wartime disappearance, a staged grave for a man the world thought dead. Clara felt a chill as she reread Vollner's confession letter. The ink's modern composition, the car's relocated timeline, everything pointed to one conclusion. This wasn't the colonel's death site. It was his erasure. The uniform, the documents, the perfectly placed relics, all part of a narrative built to mislead. Someone wanted history to see a dead Nazi, Lucas said quietly, when in reality he was working for them. The discovery reframed the past like a cruel trick of light. Vollner's car wasn't a relic of the Third Reich's fall. It was a Cold War artifact, evidence of how far governments would go to bury the truth beneath the mountain rock. By late autumn 2024, the puzzle had grown too large to ignore. Every new document peeled back another layer of deception. Deep inside the U.S. National Archives, Clara and Lucas uncovered a folder labeled Operation Paperclip, Supplementary Assets, a program known for recruiting German scientists and officers to work for Allied intelligence after the war. Most of the names were familiar from history books, engineers, doctors, chemists, but at the bottom of one page, half-smudged and misfiled under consultants, was a name that froze Clara where she stood, Erich Vollner. Next to it, transferred under supervision, Buenos Aires, 1949. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the microfilm. A photograph emerged, faded, grainy, a man older, heavier, with streaks of gray in his hair, but unmistakably Vollner. The caption read, Subject 47B Field Analysis Division. The record ended abruptly with a death certificate issued in 1972 by the Argentine Ministry of Health under the alias Erich Volland. No repatriation, no burial site, no official obituary. Vollner hadn't vanished in 1945. He had been extracted, given a new life, and buried under another name. But that revelation only deepened the mystery of the cave. If the colonel had been living comfortably in South America, who had died in his place in Bavaria? The car, the papers, the skeleton, all planted to make the world believe he'd perished fleeing Berlin. The final deception. Clara stared at the blurry photo of Vollner, the man who had become a ghost in history's margins. "He didn't disappear," she whispered. "He was erased by design." The implications were staggering. His escape had been orchestrated by Allied intelligence to shield him from prosecution and secure the research he carried. The so-called Valkensee cache wasn't treasure. It was data. Project Morgenröte. But the one question that still burned through every sleepless night was simple. If the real Colonel Vollner died in Argentina in 1972, then who had been buried with his car in that frozen Bavarian cave? The answer arrived not from the archives, but from the lab. Forensic reconstruction of the skull recovered from the Mercedes had been painstaking. Months of DNA sequencing, bone mapping, and facial modeling. When the results came in, Lucas stood silently as the computer-generated face slowly formed on the screen. It wasn't Vollner. The jawline was broader, the brow heavier, the proportions off just enough to reveal another man entirely. The genetic markers confirmed it. The remains belonged to Otto Rademann, a known SS courier who had vanished with Vollner's convoy during the final days of the war. The match was later verified through a distant relative living in Dresden. The DNA identical. The mystery of the driver's seat finally solved. Rademann had been the decoy. While the world believed Colonel Vollner had fled south from Berlin and perished in the mountains, the colonel himself had boarded a military transport bound for Allied territory, protected by the very enemies he'd once fought. The cave had been his cover story, a grave built from lies to mislead Soviet pursuit. Rademann's body had been dressed in Vollner's civilian coat, placed behind the wheel, and sealed into the mountain to ensure the illusion was perfect. The documents, the uniform, even the confession letter, all carefully arranged decades later when the Cold War reopened the site to reinforce the fiction. Clara felt both awe and disgust. The precision, the ruthlessness. It was everything Vollner had stood for. He had escaped justice not once but twice, first from the Reich's collapse, then from history's memory. Lucas closed the case file slowly, the edges trembling in his hands. "So the man in the cave," he said quietly, "wasn't the colonel at all. He was the one left behind to die in his place." Clara nodded, her voice low. Vollner didn't just vanish, he made sure someone else did instead. The revelation reframed the entire story. The cave was no burial site. It was a monument to deception, the final act of a man who understood that survival depended not on erasing the past, but on rewriting it. Winter had settled over the Bavarian Alps by the time the final sweep of the cave was ordered. The investigation was days from closing when a technician examining the Mercedes trunk noticed something strange. The metal lining didn't ring true when tapped. Hidden beneath the corroded panel, sealed under decades of grime, was a false compartment no one had seen before. With surgical precision, they pried it open. Inside sat a single glass vial, airtight and dust-coated, small enough to fit in a palm. Within it, tightly wound, were 2 microfilm reels, perfectly preserved in oil. When the reels were developed under controlled lab conditions, the images that flickered onto the monitor froze the room into silence. Blueprints, signatures, and stamped documents, all marked Reichsministerium für Bewaffnung und Munition, the Nazi Ministry of Armaments. The first reel contained technical schematics for weapons designs long thought lost, early jet propulsion models, chemical formulas, and coded directives referencing Project Morgenröte, Project Dawn. The second reel was worse. Bank ledgers dated 1945, listing accounts transferred from occupied Europe to foreign stabilization trusts. At the bottom of the ledger were familiar names, financial institutions that still existed, rebranded as global corporations. The trail was clear. Vollner's escape had not just preserved secrets, it had preserved fortunes. Money, power, and influence born in the ashes of war had quietly grown into the foundations of the modern European economy. The mountain hadn't hidden a fugitive, it had hidden a legacy. Within hours, the site was sealed again under direct government order. Trucks rolled in by night, and officials arrived with documents marked Verschlusssache, classified. The cave's coordinates were erased from the official registry. Even the local police were barred from further access. Whatever truth had been uncovered in the Bavarian dark was swiftly buried again. Weeks later, Clara stood at the base of the mountain, snow whispering across the frozen ground. The lights of Berchtesgaden flickered faintly in the distance. She thought about Vollner, the soldier, the spy, the ghost who had manipulated history from the shadows. The cave was silent once more, its secrets sealed behind stone and ice. As her voice echoed softly over the archival footage of the excavation, she said, "Colonel Erich Vollner may have escaped Berlin, but he could never outrun the truth he buried in these mountains. History remembers the victors, but the mountains remember everything." This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.